This episode is sponsored by Magisterium AI, the world's #1 AI-powered guide to church teaching. Query our knowledge base of over 9,000 magisterial and Catholic theological texts and discover how AI is supercharging access to church teaching.
Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, the editor of Crux, and your host here on Last Week in the Church. This, of course, is the show where we sort through the last week on the Vatican beat. Now, in this case, of course, it's really more like the last 2 weeks because we missed last week for reasons that I will get to in just a moment. But let me set the table in terms of what we got for you. Normally, if you watch this show, you know that normally we have a kind of potpourri of stories, normally 4, 5, 6, whatever. This week, however, we really have 2 big stories that we're going to try to sink our teeth into in a more thorough and therefore satisfying fashion. So we begin with the end of an era. Yesterday, Pope Francis accepted the resignation of Cardinal Sean O'Malley, who for more than 20 years, since 2003, has led the Archdiocese of Boston and been one of the most influential Catholic prelates, not simply in the United States, but anywhere in the world. And at the same moment, Pope Francis named Bishop Richard Henning of Providence as O'Malley's successor in Boston. I have a reflection both on O'Malley and also on Henning. We will dive in to both of those. And then the second big ticket item we've got for you this week, as we would say here in Italy, are our secondo, that is our second dish, our big, meaty, satisfying, filling dish, is Olympic outrages. The Paris Olympics from the beginning have been marked by some really remarkable, dazzling, heroic, inspiring athletic performances, but they have also been marred by a couple of, quite frankly, completely unnecessary controversies to which there has been Catholic subtext. We will unpack all of that, and in particular, try to make sense of why it took the Vatican 8 days to wade into one particular element of all of this. So that's what we've got on the menu for you this week. Please do not go anywhere. Do not touch that dial. Don't get out of your seat. Don't go to the bathroom. Don't go for a snack, because I will be right back. Okay, everybody, welcome back. Happy Tuesday to you. Happy Tuesday, August 6th in the year of our Lord, 2024. First, let me begin with an apology. We were supposed to deliver a program last week, and in the end, we were unable to do it. I want to thank, by the way, those of you who wrote in, and several of you did, to make sure that my health was okay, that that I hadn't taken a tumble or had a stroke or something. I promise you, physically, I was fine. The issue was, my wife Elise and I were all set to shoot this show last Monday. The power went out here in Rome. You know, in Italy, we joke that Rome is where the first world meets the third. And last week was sort of proof of the point, because the power grid simply collapsed under the combined weight of the August heat and demands for air conditioning and so forth and so on. Our power was out all the way from Monday to Tuesday. So Tuesday, again, we were all set to shoot the show. And once again, the power grid went out. At that point, it was going to be Wednesday at the earliest before we could get this done, which meant it would be Thursday before the show was out there. And it just didn't seem to make any sense, so we skipped it. Apologies, although, quite honestly, this isn't our fault. The people who should be apologizing to you are the people who are responsible for maintaining the Roman electric grid. And if you are an astute Catholic observer of this show, I'm sure your mind has already leapt to the obvious conclusion, which is, if this is happening now, what's going to happen next year during the Jubilee when 35 million additional people are here consuming electricity? Frankly, that is a great question. And all of us should be asking it of responsible officials, both in Rome and in the Vatican. All right. That said, let's dive into the news agenda this week. We begin with the end of an era. So over the weekend, rumors first reported by Rocco Palmo of Whispers in the Loggia and later confirmed by other media outlets began to circulate that Boston's Cardinal Sean O'Malley, who recently turned 80 and therefore lost his right to vote in the next conclave, that his resignation as the Archbishop of Boston was about to be accepted by Pope Francis, and that as his successor, the Pope was going to name Bishop Richard Henning of the Diocese of Providence in Rhode Island. And on Monday, that indeed came to pass. At noon, Rome time, meaning 6 on the East Coast in the United States, the Vatican put out its daily news bulletin indicating that, in fact, Cardinal O'Malley's resignation has been accepted and that Bishop Henning has been named to take over the helm, therefore becoming the Metropolitan Archbishop. So he's now Archbishop Richard Henning. And as the Metropolitan Archbishop, that means he has direct authority over Boston and a kind of indirect supervisory role over 6 other dioceses scattered among Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. So that's where we are. I'd like to say a brief word first about O'Malley and second about Henning. Let me be very clear, ladies and gentlemen. This is one of those full disclosure moments. I cannot be objective on either score, okay? First of all, Cardinal Sean O'Malley is someone I've known for more than 20 years. He has been, I hope I'm not overstating the case when I say that he is not simply a source, but a friend. In addition to that, he is a Capuchin Franciscan. I was educated by the Capuchins. I am enormously loyal to the Capuchins. I owe them a greater debt than I could ever possibly repay. And so my judgment clearly is a bit clouded by that fact. As far as Bishop Henning goes, to be honest with you, I don't believe he and I have ever met, but in any event, we certainly are not particularly close. But there is an aspect of his biography that I share, which is his academic background and mine are both in biblical studies. And so I'm going to say something about that once again, because this comes straight out of my personal biography. I can't claim to strict objectivity. I nevertheless believe, of course, that everything I'm about to say is 100% indisputably, metaphysically, ontologically correct. All right, let us begin with Cardinal Sean O'Malley. Had there never been a clerical sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, Cardinal Sean O'Malley would still go down as one of the most remarkable and impressive leaders in the recent history of American Catholicism. That would be on account, for instance, of his outspoken advocacy on behalf of migrants and refugees. And it's not simply that he's been an advocate. He's been in the trenches. You know, in the 70s and 80s, the work he did at the Centro Hispanico in Washington, the personal time he has spent in migrant and refugee communities, the way he has invested himself makes him one of the preeminent Catholic voices on this issue. He would also go down for his unabashed, robust, and uncompromising pro-life leadership. He is one of the most outspoken and uncompromising pro-life leaders in American Catholicism. And when you consider that he has played that role from his perch in Boston, one of the most liberal and pro-choice urban areas in America. I mean, they don't call it the People's Republic of Massachusetts for nothing. The fact that he has nevertheless never watered down, never compromised, never softened his advocacy on that front is fairly impressive. And I think perhaps most importantly, he is a man who has incarnated the Catholic center at a time of incredible polarization in Catholic life in America. I mean, alternatively, over the years, O'Malley has routinely frustrated the right and the left. You know, he has frustrated the left because he has never deviated from his pro-life stances and his basic Catholic orthodoxy. He has frustrated the right because he refuses to shun and ostracize people who don't share those values. I mean, you remember the way that some on the Catholic right went absolutely nuts when he celebrated Ted Kennedy's funeral mass in 2009. Cardinal O'Malley said at the time, "It is a tragedy that Senator Kennedy was not pro-life. That doesn't mean that there weren't virtues to his record, doesn't mean he's not entitled to a Catholic funeral," and absolutely rejected the suggestion that the church ought to simply wash its hands of anyone who was not 100% coherent with its teachings. I mean, if that's all Sean O'Malley had done, it would still qualify him for a major chapter in 21st century American Catholic history. But of course, ladies and gentlemen, there has been a clerical sexual abuse crisis in Catholicism. And nobody keeps records on this kind of stuff, but I am willing to bet right now that there is not a single prelate in the Catholic Church over the last 25 years who has spent more time sitting with victims and survivors of clerical sexual abuse, listening to those victims, praying with those victims, crying at times with those victims, and struggling with those victims to achieve some kind of justice than Sean O'Malley. I mean, look, there is a legitimate debate that can be had about how well Cardinal O'Malley implemented his own prescriptions about the appropriate response, zero tolerance to clerical sexual abuse, both in the Archdiocese of Boston and also as president of the Pope's Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors, which is the body the Pope created in 2014 as his tip of the spear on reform. Ever since O'Malley has been the president, there's a legitimate argument to be made that both in his own archdiocese and on the global level with the Commission, the Cardinal is leaving behind a good deal of unfinished business, that it was an uneven and kind of mixed record. And I suspect Sean O'Malley would be the first person to grant that point. But I nevertheless want to underline this, that over the course of the last 25 years, that is from the beginning of the clerical sexual abuse scandals to today, there has been a Copernican revolution in the Catholic Church from officially, out loud, as a matter of policy, insisting that the Church's first concern ought to be the rights of accused clergy, to officially, out loud, and as a matter of policy, saying that the Church's first concern ought to be the interests of victims and survivors. And the Nicholas Copernicus of this story, ladies and gentlemen, is Sean O'Malley. And for that, I think he is going to be remembered over the course of time as one of the most consequential, influential, and important figures in the story of Catholicism of our era and going forward. By the way, his story is not yet finished, because his resignation as the Archbishop of Boston doesn't mean he's finished as an advisor to Pope Francis, doesn't even necessarily mean he's finished leading the Pontifical Commission. That assignment won't expire until the Pope names the successor there. So we will see if there are yet more acts in the Sean O'Malley story. But I'm here to tell you, the story we have seen so far has been fairly riveting. Now, let me shift gears briefly to the appointment, now Archbishop Richard Henning, as O'Malley's successor. Most Catholic bishops, their academic background is either in dogmatic theology or in canon law. Henning is that rare case of a bishop who actually studied Scripture. That is, he studied the Bible. His degrees in sacred Scripture come from the Catholic University of America and from the University of St. Thomas Aquinas, popularly known as the Anglican, here in Rome. His doctoral dissertation was on the discourses of Peter and Paul in the Acts of the Apostles. Now, my own academic background is also in Scripture. I have a master's degree in religious studies with a concentration in Scripture, and I was working on a doctorate when I kind of got seduced or shanghaied by journalism and went another direction. And here are two things that I would tell you about clerics in the Catholic Church whose background is Scripture as opposed to other disciplines. One, Scripture study tends to inculcate a kind of non-ideological approach to things. I mean, look, there is no left-wing or right-wing way, for instance, to conjugate a verb in Koine Greek, which is the version of Greek in which most of the New Testament is written. There is simply right and wrong. In other words, Scripture study tends to foster an appreciation for expertise over ideology, which is, of course, a refreshing contrast to the deeply ideological age in which we live. And the second thing about Scripture study is that it fosters an appreciation for diversity. I think there is this myth sometimes in popular Christian psychology that Christianity at the beginning was entirely unified, and that diversity, division, difference in the church is kind of a later corruption. But scripture study teaches you exactly the opposite is true, that diversity goes to the very beginning of the church. I mean, the contrast between Peter and Paul, which was the object of Archbishop Henning's doctoral work. We know from the very beginning there were different modes of expressing the gospel. There were different ways of living the Christian message. And the trick was not to insist on a false uniformity, but yet to try to hold that diversity in a kind of unity in diversity. That is, to appreciate the fact that there are different ways of living one's identity as a Christian. And I would suggest to you that if now Archbishop Henning can bring those two qualities, that is, a kind of appreciation for smarts over ideology and an appreciation for diversity over a false and artificial uniformity, then I would suggest the Archdiocese of Boston is likely to be in fairly good shape going forward. All right, now shifting gears to Olympic outrages, unless you have been living under a rock for the last 10 days, you are no doubt aware that the Olympics are going on right now in Paris. And, there have been some incredible high moments, but there have also been a couple of deep controversies. The first dates to July 26th, the opening ceremony of the Paris Olympics, in which a bizarre sort of performance was staged, in which a number of performers, including a sort of cohort of drag queens, staged what appeared to most people to be a kind of parody of the Last Supper. There were some efforts by organizers after the fact to say, well, no, this wasn't actually the Last Supper, it was a Dionysian bacchanal. Those efforts kind of fell apart when some of these performers themselves went in social media to say, no, it was the Last Supper, we're proud of it. And this triggered a kind of massive reaction around the world, beginning with the Catholic bishops of France and radiating out from there. Bishops from Malta to Minnesota, from Nigeria to Nicaragua, and every point at the compass in between, raised voices in protest. Then it kind of went out from the Christian world to include Jewish and, in particular, Islamic leaders, because in Islam, Jesus is regarded not as the divine Son of God, but he is regarded as a prophet to be revered and honored. So there was protest in many Islamic circles as well. And so, all of that created a kind of massive tempest that marred the opening days of the games. And then, later on, another controversy emerged when an Italian female boxer withdrew after 46 seconds in the ring in her match against her Algerian competitor, who, it turns out, has some of the genetic characteristics of a male. And this raised a debate about gender and equity and sexual identity and basic fairness. And, both of these controversies have therefore sort of cast a shadow, I think it is fair to say, over the games. Now, the most interesting bit of subtext to all of this probably is the fact that the Vatican finally weighed in to the controversy over the Last Supper, but it took them a full 8 days to do so. I'm going to get to that in a moment and try to unpack for you why I think that is. But let me first say this about these controversies that have sort of enveloped these games. My wife and I have been dipping in and out of the Olympics, like a lot of people, I think, and I think it is fair to say we have been dazzled by a great deal of what we have seen. I mean, on Sunday, for instance, we watched 2 Italian women win the gold medal in women's doubles in tennis. It's the first gold medal in tennis Italy has ever won in its entire history, and only the 3rd tennis medal of any kind Italy has ever won. It was a nail-biting, phenomenal match from start to finish. inspirational, heart-pumping, just like great stuff. And these games have been full of that sort of thing. My favorite moment actually came last week. It was Tuesday. At around the same time, it was sort of noon here in Europe, so early morning in the States. There were two competitions that most people don't pay a lot of attention to. One was the women's judo final, and the other was the men's kayak final. I didn't even know kayak was an Olympic event, to be honest with you. But in any event, these two finals, as fate would have it, took place at the same time. They were both, the gold medals in both competitions were won by Italians. Now that by itself would have been striking. But consider this. Both of these Italians came from a little town called Roncadelle, which is up in the far north of Italy, near Brescia. It's a little town of like 9,000 people. Can you imagine what it meant to that town? That one of their native sons and one of their native daughters both won gold medals on the same day at basically the same time. Folks, I come from a small town. I grew up in rural western Kansas. My grandparents lived in a place called Hill City, which is my candidate for the worst place name in America because there is no hill and there sure as hell is no city. I mean, we're talking about a one-stoplight town, a few hundred people. I can only imagine what it would have meant to that town if two of their own had won gold medals. I mean, that was a magical, marvelous moment, right? And the thing of it is, the fact that all of that has been obscured or overshadowed by these completely pointless and needless controversies that should have been avoided by the organizers of these games. I mean, they should have reviewed the contents of the opening ceremonies and realized it was going to be deeply offensive to Christians and other religious believers. They should have anticipated that there was going to be a controversy over who was eligible to participate in women's events and establish clear guidelines to determine who could and who couldn't. The fact that they didn't see either of these train wrecks coming and have allowed the incredible achievements of these remarkable athletes to be marred and obscured and occluded, to me, that's borderline unforgivable. And obviously, one hopes that going forward, we can focus on the competition and not the controversy. All right, finally, we come to the Vatican's role in all of this, because, as I mentioned, this opening ceremony with the Last Supper parody, that occurred on July 26th. By the morning of July 27th, there was an avalanche of Catholic reaction, beginning with the French Catholic Bishops' Conference, radiating out from there, including bishops from all points of the compass, several in the United States, including quite prominently Bishop Robert Barron of Winona, Rochester, who of course is the founder of the very popular Word on Fire ministry, which is also a major supporter of Crux, and, any number of others. And then the reaction simply continued to build. Officials responsible for the production at first issued a kind of, first they attempted to suggest that it wasn't the Last Supper. Now, as I say, that fell apart because performers who had taken part in it actually went to social media to say, yes, it was the Last Supper and we're proud, et cetera, et cetera. Then organizers issued a kind of half-hearted apology, which didn't really indicate that they were sorry for the performance itself, merely that some people had gotten upset. That didn't really satisfy anybody, and so the controversy sort of went on. And through all of this, the striking thing was that the one religious leader that no one had heard from was Pope Francis himself. He, of course, the opening ceremony was a Saturday, so he had one bite at the apple the next day on Sunday when he delivered his noontime Angelus address. Many of us were expecting he might have had something to say. In fact, he didn't. And for the next 7 days, the Pope basically kept his silence until, belatedly, this past Saturday at 7:47 p.m. local Rome time, which is a highly unusual hour for the Vatican to release a communiqué, the Vatican press office put out a statement indicating that the Vatican wanted to join its voice to those of others, indicating that it had been saddened by the opening ceremony in the Olympics, that it regretted the offense to deeply held religious beliefs, and that while it didn't want to question the right of freedom of expression, it did want to insist that freedom of expression has to be balanced against respect for the feelings of others. Okay? Now, two questions. One, why did it take so long for the Vatican to speak? Two, why eventually did it put out this statement? Let me take each in turn. One, why did it take so long to speak? Well, part of it may be diplomatic logic. You know, the Vatican typically doesn't condemn China's human rights record. To date, the Pope hasn't really, in any direct way, gone after Vladimir Putin for the invasion of Russia, in both cases because there are diplomatic interests at stake. In China, it's in part the protection of the Christian minority in the country, and also just broader geopolitical questions. With Russia, it's the Vatican's desire to play a peacemaker role in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. France recently put a purported right to abortion in its constitution. They recently had elections in which a left-wing coalition may well come to power that could be hostile to the church. Pope may not have wanted to upset the diplomatic apple cart. In addition to that, he may just not have wanted to add additional fuel to the fire. And in addition to that, this is a pope who doesn't like being painted into a corner. And the fact that people were clamoring for him to say something probably had exactly the opposite effect, making it even less likely that he was going to do what people wanted him to do. Now, given all of that, then why did, even if this wasn't the Pope himself, why did the Vatican finally break its silence? Well, the answer to that question, ladies and gentlemen, ironically enough, is Turkish President Recep Erdogan. Erdogan, during the course of the last week, had first announced that he was going to call Pope Francis to ask him to speak out. He then made that phone call on Thursday and issued a public statement saying that he had spoken to the Pope. He had called this attack on the Last Supper disgusting and had said that the Pope had complimented him, praised him for his defense of religious and sacred values. Now, that left the Vatican with two choices. What do? Do you confirm Erdogan's version of events, thereby, being drawn into a controversy you had hoped to avoid? Or do you leave him hanging, therefore embarrassing someone with whom you have an important diplomatic relationship? The Vatican obviously chose the latter. Remember, Pope Francis is very interested in outreach to the Islamic world. He's very interested in trying to redefine the Vatican away from being a Western institution to being a genuinely non-aligned global institution. I think he believes that the dialogue with Turkey and with Erdogan is critically important in that regard. And if the price of maintaining that dialogue is backing Erdogan when it comes to the protest over the Olympic ceremony, I believe Pope Francis regarded that as a price worth paying. It's also worth noting that in the same statement, Erdogan had raised the possibility that Pope Francis could be a broker in the Gaza conflict. That's something the Vatican would dearly love to do. And if the price of getting Erdogan's support for that role was this statement, I think that was something that's a bridge they were willing to cross. All right, that is our show for this week. You can find full coverage of these stories and much, much more on the Crux site. That is cruxnow.com, cruxnow.com. I will be back here, barring new blackouts in the Roman power grid. I will be back here next week, same bat time, same bat channel. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, stay cool in the summer heat. Have a fantastic and blessed week. We will talk to you again very soon.